Here we are. We be casted. Hi, I'm Aimee Terese.
If you have surfed through the lefty Twitter sphere over the last few years, you might have come across the Twitter account of one Aimee Terese, who has stirred up some controversy throughout that time. On the one hand, Terese appears on the surface to be a soft-spoken Australian leftist podcaster, with some committed views on Marxism and socialism with the occasional hot take, and if there's one thing Twitter loves to respond to with likes or with a massive ratio disparity, it's accounts with hot takes. However, on the other hand, some of her takes provoke a harsh and abrasive response, many of the responses being from other left-wingers on the internet, because some of the takes don't always conform to leftist thinking. Why is this the case, and is there any validity to any of the takes Terese makes? And is Aimee Terese a real person or just a catfishing troll tweeting out hot takes for the sake of making hot takes? In this editorial video essay, we will look into the views, opinions, and a sample of Twitter hot takes made by Aimee Terese, as well as look over the reactions to Terese and whether or not she should be taken seriously as an individual on the left. Now, unfortunately, as I was drafting and editing the script for this video, a new development came into play. A few days ago, Aimee Terese's Twitter account was banned. According to this email from Twitter staff, the offending tweet shown here was calling for current Massachusetts Senator and presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren to be beaten, as in the election, not necessarily physical, but Twitter saw it differently, I guess. This presented a hurdle for me, because Twitter was her primary handle for communicating her thoughts and philosophy, as we'll get to, but I did manage to capture a few essential tweets in order to summarize why people on the left dislike her. So, for the sake of clarification, the initial reason for the creation of this video before the Twitter ban was out of morbid curiosity as to why so many left-wingers on Twitter have had an issue with Aimee Terese. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to even attempt to understand why mobs form whenever someone has a different take or opinion, as is the case with multiple accounts on Twitter, nor should this be seen as a defense of any viewpoint stated by her. So, this video is intended to examine and gloss over the views and opinions expressed by Aimee Terese, and should in no way be depicted as a bait into drama, or even an endorsement of sorts. So, consider this video a helpful, slightly impartial guide into the mind of one of the most controversial personalities in the leftosphere. If you're looking for petty insults and jokes, well, no, this is not the place or avenue for those sorts of tactics, unless your channel is called Progressive Voice. Anyway, briefly looking over what used to be her Twitter handle, Aimee Terese describes herself as being a postgrad. I assume that means she's studying for a postgraduate degree or has already graduated. I can't confirm for now. But she has clarified that she is, or at some point, a law student and a co-host of the podcast What's Left, where she co-hosts with Benjamin Studebaker, who is currently studying for his PhD at Cambridge University. The podcast describes itself on his Patreon page as followed. What's Left is a weekly podcast hosted by Aimee Terese and Benjamin Studebaker, discussing political theory, philosophy, and current affairs from a left-wing perspective. Currently, the What's Left podcast makes over $1,600 a month. Terese was also a co-host on the left-wing podcast Dead Pundit Society up until last year when she departed. To some drama, of course. On the What's Left podcast, as mentioned in passing in the introduction, Aimee often comes across as a soft-spoken and gentle leftist, even when discussing tense political issues which are the focus of leftist thinking. Some of these issues discussed on the podcast include abolishing the police, which she states she is against, universal health care, the social and economic harms done by neoliberalism, we'll come back to that term, the possible impeachment of President Donald Trump, and as we'll get into, the problems with an Elizabeth Warren Democratic nomination for president in 2020. Warren is a favorite target of Aimee Terese.
Yeah, I mean, it's still amazing to me the extent to which tons and tons of like progressive groups and like Warren-friendly journalists and stuff are still coming out last week, like even after the whole spectacle, coming out and saying, you know, we shouldn't be giving too much grief to either party. Like, we need to think about, you know, progressives need to be united, blah, blah, blah. Like, still trying to pull this unity card crap. Just like, what are you talking about? They're in a competition, first off. But secondly, what, are you high? Like...
However, her primary source of communicating her viewpoints and perspective, or what was her primary source before getting banned, is her Twitter handle seen here at Aimee Terese, no space, which we will use as a tool to dive deeper and to see why so many people on the left Twitter sphere get angry and upset at Aimee. At the risk of unintentionally misrepresenting what I've read and listened to so far, based upon what I've seen and heard regarding her views, the best way to describe Aimee Terese is that of a disenfranchised leftist Marxist-Socialist, who has more issues with the modern left than the right, at least from the episodes and tweets gathered for this essay. In fact, especially on the very first episode of What's Left, and on the December episode regarding the United Kingdom Labour Party's loss to the Tories' last general election, Aimee Terese has a habit of repeating the phrase, "there is no left," hence, you know, the name of the show, and also the name of the first episode, of the left, because, you know, what's left of the left, get it?
Part of the reason that, like, when I thought up the name, What's Left, like, I really like it as kind of a question, and it sort of asks us to reckon with, like, what is a leftist politics, but also, like, what is out there in the world that we can make use of, right? Like, and I think there's a whole lot that potentially can be, you know, accumulated for a leftist project in useful ways. So we would hopefully, like, you know, not just restrict this to being some kind of like orthodox engagement with, you know, a very narrow set of theorists. It's rather more playful, I think, and would hope to kind of make use of a variety of concepts and thinkers and that sort of thing.
Anyway, Aimee Terese also refers to herself as a class-first leftist, or more appropriately, a class reductionist, comparing how she sees the world with other left-winged women like Angela Nagle, the author of Kill All Normies, and Amber Frost, one of the co-hosts of Capo Trap House and a contributor to the lefty magazine Jacobin. We'll come back to that later, and how all three of them have been seemingly kicked out of the left. She also says there is no such thing as a Marxist feminist, despite being a woman on the left and a socialist with a habit of Marxist thought, as seen in this tweet, and also that a noted Marxist and feminist like Angela Davis would fall under the category of being a Marxist feminist, and also a whole host of literature on Marxist feminism out there. On the same episode, on the Labour Party's loss from last December, Aimee Terese showed hostility towards what she refers to as Anarchist Neoliberals, which sounds like an oxymoron, since our idea of anarchism would mean hostility and distrust towards the idea of the state government to the point of some advocating for abolishing the state, while neoliberalism more or less is comfortable with the idea of the state, albeit those in power will use it to push gradual social and economic centrist policies while comfortable with an interventionist foreign policy. See Presidents Clinton and Obama. Aimee Terese has a particular problem with Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of the nominees for the Democratic nomination for president in the U.S. this coming election in November, and there are a lot of valid reasons why Warren is a discount Bernie Sanders, never mind the fact that Warren wasn't always a Democrat, but a Republican until she was 46 in the mid-90s. But it's not as if anyone is able to make clear, cohesive distinctions between Warren and Senator Bernie Sanders, who's clearly the best candidate out of all of the nominees and who can best beat Trump, assuming Bernie Sanders wins the nomination. Currently, he's surging in the polls as I'm writing this, but that doesn't mean Senator Warren isn't eating up any of Sanders' support. At least, hypothetically, if she wasn't running.
Well, I think at this point, basically, what they're running with is a fairly ad hoc, scattergun approach, because for the most part, most of the left media were caught, I think, with their pants around their ankles when Elizabeth Warren basically began to look like a much bigger threat. They realized the threat about a month ago, sort of tying in with the Working Families Party endorsement and the fact that she came first in a couple of polls in early states. And so I think ever since then they've been scrambling to catch up. And in playing catch-up, I think what they're failing to do is take a step back, figure out what the most strategic way of attending to this is. And by taking this sort of scattergun approach that would look to, for instance, incongruities in sort of things she said in the past versus, or rather, things she said in the present versus things she's done in the past, that sort of thing. Basically demonstrating that, you know, there's some disjuncture between the way she talked about an anecdote today versus the way she talked about it 10 years ago. Like, I firmly believe that this will not work. I think that, to me, it is very, very reminiscent of the, basically this is a microcosm of what happened with the mainstream media with Trump in 2016. I think it was all fun and games with Trump until it became really, really clear that he's going to take the nomination. And then the mainstream media sort of did a 180 between being titillated by him and the fact that he was great for ratings, with the underlying premise being that he wasn't really a serious contender and he wasn't really a threat, to him suddenly being a very real threat and then ultimately the nominee. And then they would just start going down the list of sort of times he's lied or done something scandalous, as though that was going to undermine his support. And we sort of saw throughout the 2016 campaign, like with each different scandal, voters didn't care. And the media got more and more outraged by the fact that, you know, each scandal was worse than the last. And, you know, you fairly firmly remember people saying, like, this has to be it. This has to be the time that you know, this time, this is really, he said, grab him by the pussy, like, you can't possibly survive this. Nobody cares, particularly once they've had enough time to familiarize themselves with the candidate and buy in. And I think there's enough of a contingent of Elizabeth Warren supporters in the mainstream media and in the sort of chattering classes that this ad hoc, like, trying to make her, like, ad hoc finding stories that she told that don't quite line up, all it does is it makes it seem like sour grapes, and it makes them rush to her defense even more, particularly if you do it on issues of sort of emotional import, because what people do is they take the emotional truth of the lie and then they engage in apologetics for her. So, like, most women, it would seem, can relate to this idea of sort of pregnancy discrimination against women, that sort of thing. And so what they take away from that story and the fact that, like, it's demonstrable.
With Warren, we're acting the way that we've acted really with Trump since 2018, which is scandal-based.
And culture war-based.
Yeah, culture war-based, scandal-based. Are they good on this particular identity group or that particular identity group? Have they done something wrong in the past? What instead needs to happen is that the connection between Warren and the ordinary person has to be directly assaulted. And every time that the left media says, well, Warren's, all right, she's a progressive, she's just not as good as Bernie, that's not challenging that connection.
No, it's
that's
reinforcing
it
it's legitimating
by giving it legitimacy.
One thing that becomes clear when listening to Aimee Terese on her podcast and reading her tweets is that she has a particular fixation with the term neoliberal. For the sake of clarity, and to summarize, the term neoliberalism refers to a model or form of liberalism that emphasizes the value of free market capitalism and is associated with laissez-faire economics and economic liberalization, which involves privatization, deregulation, free trade, and austerity. However, a meme amongst critics of Aimee Terese is, according to Aimee, everything is neoliberal. For example, on an episode of What's Left, Aimee Terese referred to the Dr. Phil show and Dr. Phil himself as neoliberal, criticizing Dr. Phil for chastising a guest on the show for wanting to spend money on a hypothetical $1 million check given by Phil on studying at university, to which he responded, "That's not how the world works."
And she was also, back in 2010 when she was creating the CFPB, she got Dr. Phil's endorsement to be the head of the CFPB. So even though he doesn't ordinarily get involved in politics, which I think is also a very funny thing to say, but so here we go. TV's Dr. Phil is getting political. TV's best known shrink is endorsing Harvard economics professor Elizabeth Warren, a frequent guest on his show, to be the first federal consumer protection czar. Quote, "I could not more strongly support Professor Warren's appointment to head up this new bureau," he wrote on his personal blog under the headline, "Elizabeth Warren, Fighting for Consumers. But you don't need me to tell you how to feel about her," he says. It's an unusual departure for Dr. Phil, who has been close to fellow Texans, former President George W. Bush and wife Laura, but has never come out publicly for a political candidate before. Warren is in the running to head the controversial new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, created last month when Congress passed a sweeping reform bill aimed at curbing some of the Wall Street excesses blamed for the most recent financial crisis. So presumably that was Dodd-Frank. President Obama must make the appointment. "As you know, I don't talk politics on this blog or on the show," Dr. Phil wrote. But then went on to urge fans to, quote, "write or email your congressperson and tell him or her how you feel." Oh, pardon me. Sorry. Oh, Amy's exhausted. Write or email your congressperson and tell him or her how you feel. Washington, D.C. is always up to something, but this one counts.
Going back to the ranch thing.
No, that's fine, because I do deeply think that, like, a part of this, like, embedded within it is this idea of, like, I think, like, self-actualization and, like, the authentic self that is within you and, like, self-discovery and all this type of crap, which I think is very much something that is, like, unique to this, like, very modern, dare I say, maybe even postmodern era. Like, in decades prior, the idea that you would, like, you need to find yourself or go somewhere else to, like, find something within you, as opposed to, like, materially just doing what you need to do within the context it needs to be done, is, I think, something really quite new.
However, despite her seemingly contrarian views and takes over the past year or so, Aimee does seem to take issue with several figures on the right, as in this tweet criticizing libertarian economist Milton Friedman, anarchist philosopher Robert Nozick, and objectivist and right-wing figure Ayn Rand. Aimee has also criticized Canadian conservative philosopher Jordan Peterson on several occasions in tweets and on the What's Left podcast. Over the last year or so, Aimee Terese has built a reputation on Twitter and elsewhere as someone willing to pick fights and beefs with fellow leftists, some of whom could actually prove to provide useful information and be allies with Aimee. For example, Aimee has gone after Ben Burchis, a professor of philosophy. There's this whole podcast drama, miscommunication, whatever going on, but it's a common theme for Aimee to go after others on the left Twittersphere, despite Professor Burchis having a rather nuanced opinion on cancel culture, which is a topic Aimee Terese devotes a lot of time to. There's also her beef with lefty publication Jacobin. There are several valid criticisms of Jacobin that you could make from a lefty perspective. Mostly its foreign policy coverage in Central and South America, and the magazine has danced around whether or not Elizabeth Warren is actually a progressive or not. The latter probably explains why Aimee's got a problem with Jacobin. Most notably, for a while, Aimee has had a particular beef with Brooklyn-based anarcho-communist Jamie Peck, who is also a contributor to the lefty show The Majority Report with Sam Cedar, as well as the co-host of the Antifada, which recently ran an episode arguing for abolishing the police, a position Aimee vehemently disagrees with. This beef's probably because Peck's into anarchism and Aimee is opposed to it because, according to Aimee, Marx is against it, while Beck was digging up info on Rolling Stone journalist Matt Taibbi's behavior in Russia and pointing out a picture of Jamie with noted right-wing, ultra-conservative Catholic troll Milo Yiannopoulos, ironically another person who was banned from Twitter. Aimee has had many hot takes she gets off her chest. I don't know if it's the copious amounts of Red Bull she consumes or whatever, especially as of late, with one of her more outrageous takes being about her home country, Australia, suffering from wildfires shown here. While it would be dishonest to say that climate change is the sole reason for these wildfires happening, because wildfires are known to be an occurrence in Australia, nobody can doubt that climate change is impacting the effects of wildfires. Aimee has also tweeted against fat acceptance, retweeting this tweet of fitness celebrity Jillian Michaels, stating that while she loves the music of singer Lizzo, she doesn't think it's going to be awesome if she gets diabetes, as you can see here, with Aimee tweeting that she did nothing wrong. But perhaps the most damning item regarding Aimee Terese aren't most of the hot takes she tweets out, but the reply guys who reply to critics of Aimee, and oddly enough, the appreciation Aimee gets from white supremacists. Specifically this article, which was published for the American Renaissance, which was founded by race realist and white supremacist Jared Taylor, and the publication is best known for its denial of the Holocaust. Not that Aimee is associated with any Holocaust denial or white supremacy, but it's not really the best avenue to get your views out. So to wrap this whole thing up, to be clear, no, I personally do not think Aimee Terese is some kind of Twitter troll who takes contrarian positions for the sake of being a contrarian on the left, nor should it be assumed Terese is being dishonest when she takes hot positions which incite reactions. Maybe her idea of what it means to be a left-winger is different from other people because of the fact that she's not American but Australian. After all, the Overton window has shifted rightward over the years, in large part due to neoliberal policy making. Then again, Aimee denies the existence of the Overton window in a tweet speculating about the possibility that Bernie Sanders, being a threat to the ruling class, would be assassinated. Which may be tinfoil hat theory, but the US government has done activities which raise suspicion. Or maybe Aimee Terese was having a bad day when she tweeted that out, I don't know. What I will say is that while there is some humor to be had at the banning of her Twitter account, personally speaking, I do not support the ban, and I'm in somewhat solidarity with those who want the accounts restored. I honestly don't think, when looking at the context of her last offending tweet, that she was calling for Elizabeth Warren to literally be beaten. I mean, it's kind of obvious she's referring to the election and the hope that Bernie would beat her in the primaries, and a ban like this could happen to any lefty who says the wrong thing. Then again, Twitter is a site which still keeps ISIS, white supremacists, and all sorts of delightful, colorful characters on its platform. Some of these characters Aimee likes to attract. Not that Aimee would have anything in common with them, of course. Thanks for watching. The best way to support this channel is by subscribing to keep up with future video essays on politics, philosophy, religion, and all sorts of lovely hot topics. Some of them Aimee Terese would like to discuss.